Shock erupted across the grand ballroom. At a lavish billionaire wedding, the air glittered with golden chandeliers and luxury floral arrangements. Guests in designer suits froze as the powerful CEO, known for his ruthless ambition, stormed forward and poured a drink over his elderly father's head. The crowd gasped, some covering their mouths, others staring in disbelief. The elderly man, dignified despite the humiliation, sat stunned, gray hair soaked, yet silent. Whispers of family secrets and bitter betrayals rippled through the hall. In a moment meant to assert power, the CEO shattered more than decorum. He shattered hearts. The wedding was meant to be remembered as the most magnificent celebration the city had ever witnessed, a night where wealth shimmered like stardust and power announced itself without shame, as crystal chandeliers the size of small rooms hung from a vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom, casting golden light over marble floors imported from Italy and walls draped in silk flown in from France, while an elite crowd of billionaires, politicians, celebrities, and corporate titans filled the hall. With murmurs of admiration and envy, their tailored suits and diamond-studded gowns reflecting not just money but status, the kind that separated rulers from the ruled. And at the very center of it all stood Adrian Blackwood, the groom, a ruthless tech CEO worth billions, hailed by magazines as a visionary genius, and feared in boardrooms as a man who crushed competitors without blinking, his smile sharp in practice as cameras flashed endlessly, capturing the image of a perfect man living a perfect life, while beside him stood his bride, elegant and composed, unaware that history was about to fracture in a way no public relations team could ever repair. Because seated quietly near the back of the hall, almost invisible among the glittering elite, was an elderly man in a worn but carefully pressed suit, his hands folded on his lap, his posture humble, his eyes heavy with pride and sadness all at once. A man who did not belong in this world of excess, yet had everything to do with it. For he was Adrian's father, Thomas Blackwood, the man who had once carried bricks on his back until his spine bent, the man who had skipped meals so his son could eat, the man who had worked 3 jobs so a boy with dreams could become a man with power, and yet no one paid him much attention, not the guests sipping vintage champagne, not the executives who owed their fortune to Adrian, not even the groom himself, who barely acknowledged the old man's presence as the ceremony unfolded with rehearsed perfection, vows spoken with polished words, applause erupting on cue, laughter echoing under the chandeliers, until the moment came for the celebratory toast, when Adrian took a crystal glass filled with amber liquid, stepped forward confidently, and the room fell silent, expecting inspiration, wisdom, or gratitude from the billionaire's son who had made it, but instead his eyes shifted, cold and deliberate, locking onto the frail figure of his father, and a strange tension rippled through the room as Adrian's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only contempt. As he began to speak about success, discipline, and knowing one's place in the world, his words sharp like blades wrapped in silk, and then, before anyone could process what was happening, he walked toward his father, the click of his polished shoes echoing louder than the music, stopping directly in front of the old man who slowly looked up, confusion flickering across his tired eyes, and in a single, horrifying motion, Adrian lifted the glass and poured the drink over his father's head, the liquid soaking his thinning gray hair, dripping down his wrinkled face, staining his suit, freezing time itself as gas exploded across the hall. Hands flew to mouths, forks clattered against plates, and the orchestra fell silent mid-note, while Thomas Blackwood sat there motionless, stunned, his shoulders trembling not from the cold drink, but from the weight of humiliation crashing down on him in front of the world. And Adrian's voice cut through the shock as he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that some people needed to be reminded of their place, that not everyone deserved to stand among greatness just because they shared blood. And with those words, the celebration shattered, revealing the ugly truth beneath the gold and diamonds, as guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in shame, others watching with morbid fascination, phones discreetly recording what would soon become a viral scandal, while the bride stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes, realizing too late that the man she married was capable of a cruelty far deeper than ambition. And still Thomas said nothing, did nothing, simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn handkerchief, and slowly wiped his face, his silence louder than any scream, his dignity standing in quiet defiance against the monstrous act. As Adrian turned away triumphantly, believing he had finally asserted dominance over the past. He despised, unaware that this single moment of public humiliation had set into motion a reckoning that would tear apart his carefully constructed empire, because buried beneath the old man's silence were secrets, sacrifices, and truths powerful enough to destroy a billionaire. And as the chandeliers continued to glow and the cameras continued to flash, no one realized that the real story of that night was only just beginning. Long before the chandeliers, before the champagne flutes and diamond rings, before the world ever learned the name Adrian Blackwood, there was only a narrow, cracked street in a forgotten industrial town where winter crept through broken windows and hope was something earned through pain, and on that street lived Thomas Blackwood, a man whose hands were permanently scarred from labor and whose back never fully straightened again after years of carrying burdens meant for machines, not men, a man, who learned early that life did not reward kindness unless it was paired with endurance. And yet when his wife died young, leaving him alone with a small boy who cried himself to sleep every night, Thomas made a silent promise that no matter how hard the world struck him, his son would never feel abandoned. And so he worked wherever someone would pay him, in factories that smelled of oil and rust, on construction sites where safety rules were suggestions rather than laws, cleaning offices at night while his son slept on a couch nearby wrapped in a borrowed blanket, eating bread and soup for weeks at a time so Adrian could have meat on his plate, saving coins in a jar labeled college, even when electricity was shut off, telling his son stories about great men who rose from nothing, not realizing that those same stories would one day be twisted into weapons against him, because Thomas never spoke about his sacrifices, never complained, never asked for gratitude, believing that love was something proven through action, not words. And when teachers noticed Adrian's intelligence and potential, Thomas took on even more work, leaving home before sunrise and returning long after midnight, missing birthdays, school plays, and first achievements, not because he didn't care, but because caring meant survival. And as Adrian grew older, his world expanded while his father shrank. The boy embarrassed by his father's worn clothes, his callous hands, the way he smelled of sweat and steel. And Thomas noticed the distance growing, but told himself it was temporary, that success often came with pride before humility, that one day his son would understand. Yet there were secrets Thomas carried that Adrian never knew, sacrifices that went far beyond exhaustion, nights when Thomas stood outside elite schools in the rain begging administrators to reconsider scholarship decisions, swallowing his dignity so his son wouldn't have to, times when he signed loan papers he couldn't read fully, trusting strangers with interest rates that would trap him in debt for decades, moments when he sold the last valuable thing his wife left behind, her wedding ring, just to buy Adrian a computer he needed to compete with richer students. And even when Adrian left home for university, ashamed to invite friends back to the small apartment, Thomas remained behind, paying tuition he could barely afford, eating alone at a small table, rereading letters that became shorter and colder over time. And when Adrian finally rose to fame, appearing on magazine covers and television interviews, Thomas watched proudly from an old television with a flickering screen, never missing a single appearance, clipping newspaper articles and storing them in a box on his bed like sacred artifacts, telling neighbors that his son was changing the world, even as Adrian stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped acknowledging the man who had given him everything. And when invitations arrived at the billionaire wedding, Thomas almost didn't go, knowing he didn't belong in that world of luxury, but he pressed his suit one last time, polished his shoes, and told himself that a father should be present for his son's biggest day no matter the distance between their hearts. And as he sat there in Grand Hall, surrounded by people who had known Adrian only in his success, Thomas carried all those memories quietly, believing that love did not need recognition to be real. And when the drink was poured over his head, when laughter and gas collided in the air, when humiliation soaked into his skin deeper than the liquid ever could, Thomas understood something with painful clarity, that his son's anger was not truly about him, but about the past Adrian wanted to erase, the poverty, the weakness, the man who reminded him where he came from. And still Thomas remained silent, because some sacrifices are so deep that even betrayal cannot erase them. And though the world saw only an old man being humiliated, what they could not see was the weight of a lifetime of love, carried without complaint, now standing on the edge of a truth that, once revealed, would change everything. Adrian Blackwood liked to tell the world a carefully edited version of his story, one where genius alone carried him from nothing to billions, where hunger was merely a metaphor and struggle a fashionable backdrop to innovation. And in interviews, he spoke about discipline, self-reliance, and cutting ties with anything that slowed progress, conveniently omitting the long nights his father spent breaking his body so that he could study, omitting the debts signed in trembling ink, omitting the sacrifices that made his ambition possible. Because as Adrian climbed higher, he learned that vulnerability was a liability and gratitude a weakness, and this belief hardened during his early years in the corporate world, where mentors taught him that power belonged to those who showed no mercy, where he watched rivals crushed, friendships traded for leverage, and ethics bent until they snapped. And each victory fed not only his bank account, but his resentment, because success did not erase his. Shame, it amplified it. Every gala and boardroom reminding him that he had once been poor, that his father still spoke with a working-class accent, that his past clung to him like a stain he could never fully wash away. And so he reinvented himself relentlessly, changing the way he spoke, the people he associated with, even the stories he told about his upbringing, slowly rewriting Thomas Blackwood from a struggling laborer into an inconvenience best kept hidden. And when advisors suggested that distancing himself from his father would protect his image, Adrian did not resist. He embraced it, telling himself that love was sentimental nonsense, that the world respected strength, not loyalty, and behind closed doors his empire grew on the same philosophy. Employees discarded were no longer useful. Partnerships broken the moment a better deal appeared. Innovation fueled by pressure and fear rather than inspiration. And the higher Adrian rose, the more isolated he became, surrounded by people who admired his wealth but not his soul. He mistook their fear for respect and their silence for approval. And when cracks began to form in his company, lawsuits quietly settled, whistleblowers paid off, ethical lines crossed in the pursuit of dominance, Adrian justified every decision by telling himself that this was the price of greatness, that those who questioned him simply didn't understand what it took to win. And the wedding meant to crown his success became instead a stage for his unresolved war with his own past, because seeing his father sitting there humble and unchanged stirred a rage he had buried for years, a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, the boy who grew up counting coins still lived inside him. And in that moment, Adrian chose cruelty as a declaration of independence, pouring the drink not just to humiliate Thomas, but to symbolically wash away the man he believed had made him weak. And as the room recoiled in horror, Adrian felt a twisted sense of triumph, believing he had finally proven that he owed nothing to anyone, unaware that this act would become the clearest evidence of his moral collapse, because power without gratitude had hollowed him out, ambition without empathy had turned him into a man capable of destroying the very foundation that supported him. And while he basked in the shock he had created, the whispers began almost immediately, investors questioning his judgment, allies reconsidering their loyalty, the public seeing not a visionary leader but a son who could publicly disgrace his own father. And still Adrian dismissed the unease, confident that money could silence any backlash, blind to the truth that respect, once lost, cannot be bought back. And as he raised his glass again, celebrating what he thought was dominance, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root, watered by arrogance, nurtured by cruelty, and destined to grow into consequences he could no longer control. The silence that followed the humiliation did not end with the wedding night. It spread like a slow poison through Adrian Blackwood's empire, seeping into boardrooms, investor meetings, and media headlines, because what the world had witnessed was not merely a family dispute, but a revelation of character. And within days, the video of the drink being poured over an elderly man's head circulated everywhere, stripped of context yet heavy with meaning, igniting outrage, boycotts, and questions no amount of public relations spin could fully contain. And as Adrian attempted damage control with carefully scripted apologies that sounded more strategic than sincere, something unexpected happened, something he had never prepared for, because Thomas Blackwood, the quiet old man who had endured humiliation without protest, finally chose to speak, not in anger or revenge, but in truth. And when journalists tracked him down to his modest apartment, expecting bitterness, they instead found a man whose voice trembled not from rage, but from exhaustion. And in a calm, measured interview, Thomas told his story, not to shame his son, but to correct the lie that greatness is born alone, revealing documents, letters, loan agreements, and photographs that showed the hidden scaffolding beneath Adrian's success. Proof of debts personally guaranteed, of early patents funded by money Thomas borrowed at devastating interest rates, of nights spent sleeping in his car to save rent so tuition could be paid, and the story struck the public like a thunderclap because it was not dramatic in the way scandals usually are. It was devastating in its simplicity. A father who had given everything and asked for nothing. And as the truth spread, something deeper emerged. Investigators began looking more closely at Adrian's company, emboldened by the collapse of his untouchable image, uncovering the ethical shortcuts, the silenced whistleblowers, the contracts built on exploitation rather than innovation, and what had once been whispered in private became impossible to ignore, leading to shareholder revolts, government inquiries, and partners quietly stepping away, while Adrian watched in disbelief as the world he controlled slipped beyond his reach, realizing too late that his greatest shield had always been perception, and once that shattered, money alone could not save him. And in the midst of this unraveling, Adrian sought out his father, not with cameras or lawyers present, but alone, standing in the same small apartment he had fled years ago, confronted by the reality he had tried to erase. And for the first time in his life, words failed him, because Thomas did not accuse, did not raise his voice, did not demand apology. He simply asked one question: whether all the power in the world had been worth losing his humanity, and that question struck harder than any public backlash, because Adrian had no answer, only the hollow realization that in trying to prove he needed no one, he had destroyed the very relationships that gave life meaning. And as legal battles continued and his company's influence waned, Adrian began the slow, painful process of reckoning, not a redemption guaranteed or complete, but an acknowledgement of wrong, understanding that some damage cannot be undone, only carried with humility. And the final image the public remembered was not of chandeliers or champagne, but of an old man standing quietly in his truth, reminding a world obsessed with success that greatness without gratitude is emptiness, and that the harshest downfall is not losing wealth or power, but realizing too late that dignity, once discarded, can never be fully reclaimed.